If you grew up in China, there's a life plan you learn before anyone formally teaches it to you. Study hard, get into a good university, find a stable job, buy an apartment, get married, have children. Nobody has to sit you down and tell you this is the correct way to live. And technically, you can choose something completely different. You can quit your job at 30 and start over. You can decide not to buy a house. You can stay single. You can choose not to have children. But here's the strange part. In China, these choices often feel much more expensive than simply make a different decision. And I don't just mean financially. So why? Why does Chinese society have such a strong default life path? The easy answer is Chinese culture is traditional, but I don't think that explains very much. Because once you look underneath the culture, you find something much more interesting. I started thinking seriously about this because I've lived in very different social environments. When I was outside China, I met people whose lives seemed to move in all kinds of directions. Someone would work for several years, quit, go back to university, change industry, move to another city, spend years traveling, and decide that marriage simply wasn't for them. Of course, their lives weren't necessarily easier. They had financial pressure, their parents had expectations, they worried about careers and relationships too. But what surprised me was that a different life path often didn't require as much explanation. Then I came back to China, and suddenly I felt that invisible timeline again. What job do you have? Have you bought a home? Are you married? When are you having children? At some point, I realized the real question wasn't, why are Chinese people so conformist? The question is actually too simple. The better question is, why does following the default path make so much practical sense in China? And that changed the whole discussion. Let's start with the family. In a highly individualistic model of adulthood, we tend to imagine a life decision like this. I make a choice, I experience the consequences. But many Chinese families operate more like an intergenerational unit. Your parents may have spent years investing in your education. They may help pay the down payment on your first apartment. They may help take care of your children. And later, you may be expected to help support them as they age. So money, care, and responsibility constantly move between generations. And the research on Chinese family actually shows how significant these flows still are. Studies have found extensive financial support from parents toward adult children, particularly around housing, while that support can also be connected to expectation of care later in life. That creates a very different choice architecture. Imagine you are 30 years old and want to quit a stable job to become a filmmaker. In a purely individual model, the calculation might be, can I afford this risk? But in a family system, the calculation becomes, my parents helped me buy this apartment. They are getting older. They are worried about my future. If I fail, will they have to support me again? Am I being irresponsible not only to myself but to them? Suddenly, a supposedly personal decision is no longer completely personal, and this is one of the first keys to understanding China. The family doesn't just give you emotional pressure, it also absorbs a huge amount of risk. And when the family absorbs the risk, the family naturally has more influence over decision. But the family alone still doesn't explain it, because for decades, China's institutions also made certain life paths unusually valuable. A stable job wasn't only a job. Historically, employment could be connected to housing, healthcare, pensions, and other benefits. Where you lived mattered. Your hukou, household registration, could affect access to public services in the city where you lived. Housing wasn't only somewhere to sleep. It became connected to wealth, education, marriage, and long-term security. China has been reforming many of these systems, and access is gradually become more portable. But the institutional history leaves heavy behind. Think about it this way. If one role gives you more predictable access to housing, education, healthcare, retirement security, and family approval, while another role gives you more uncertainty, people do not need to be brainwashed into choosing the first role. The system has already changed the price of each choice. And I think this is where many cultural explanations go wrong. We see millions of people making similar decisions and assume they must share the same values. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they are simply responding rationally to the same incentives. Housing is probably the clearest example. In China, buying an apartment can represent several things at the same time. It's an investment, it's a financial security, it can affect where your children go to school. And for many families, especially historically, home ownership has also been strongly connected to marriageability. So buying a home becomes attached to several other stages of adulthood: job, income, apartment, marriage, children, education. Each decision strengthens the next. This is why I think default life path is actually a useful phrase, because it's not simply a list of social traditions. It's an interconnected system. If you remove one piece, other pieces become harder. Now compare that with a society where renting for life is considered normal. Schools are less tightly connected to residential property, parents are less financially involved in buying their adult children's home, and marriage carries less economic expectation. You haven't necessarily created more courageous people. You've created a different environment in which being unconventional costs less. That distinction matters. But there's another kind of cost that is much harder to measure: social legitimacy. Imagine two 35-year-olds. Person A has a stable corporate job, owns an apartment, is married, and has a child. Person B left a good job, tried two startups that failed, spent a year traveling, changed industry twice, and is currently renting. Person B might actually be happier. They might even have a more interesting life. But in many Chinese social settings, Person A is much easier to explain. Your parents can explain you to relatives. Your relatives know how to evaluate you. Your older classmates know roughly where you stand. You fit into a familiar category. Person B requires a story, and that difference sounds small, but it has an enormous psychological power. Human beings don't only want money or freedom, we also want our lives to make sense to people around us. A default life path gives you a ready-made definition of progress. Good university, progress. Good company, progress. Apartment, progress. Marriage, progress. Child, progress. When you leave that path, you suddenly have to build your own definition of progress, and that is much harder. This also explains why advice like just follow your passion can feel strangely unrealistic in China. Risk is not distributed equally across societies. Recent economic research on China still finds a strong connection between precautionary saving, the social safety net, housing, and the hukou system. In other words, households save partly because of future risks. Healthcare, retirement, housing, employment still require significant private preparation. And when failure is expensive, stability becomes more valuable. So imagine two people taking exactly the same career risk. One knows that if the experiment fails, employment support, healthcare, affordable housing, and other institutions can absorb part of the damage. The other knows that saving and family will absorb much more of it. Those people are not making the same decision. The apparent choice may be identical. The downside is not. That is why comparing China and the West purely through values, collectivism versus individualism, tradition versus freedom, misses something important. A culture of stability can also emerge from economics of instability. And this is where the story gets more interesting, because younger Chinese people are increasingly questioning the default script. Some don't want to buy property, some don't want children, and some delaying marriage or rejecting entirely. Some are leaving prestigious jobs. Terms like lion flag become popular precisely because people started questioning whether the traditional race was still worth running, so the default path is becoming weaker. But here's the paradox: behavior can change faster than social legitimacy. You can choose not to marry, but your parents may still worry. You can change career at 35, but employees may still ask why. You can rent instead of buying, but relatives may still see home ownership as stability. So China today is not simply a society where everyone follows one path. It's more interesting than that. It's a society where more and more paths are becoming possible, while one path still carries much more institutional, familial, and social legitimacy than the other. And this is probably what I understand differently now. When I first came back to China, I sometimes experienced all of this as a pressure. Why does everyone care what job I have? Why does marriage have a timeline? Why does buying a house feel like a life milestone? Why is changing direction so difficult? But the deeper I looked, the less convincing the simpler the explanation became. It's not just because Chinese people value conformity. It's because family responsibility, housing, public institution, risk, and social recognition have historically reinforced one another. Together, they create a past that is simply easier to justify financially, socially, and emotionally. And I think this gives us a more useful way to understand cultural differences in general. When people in other society make choices that seem strange to us, maybe we shouldn't begin by asking, why do they think like that? Maybe we should ask, what kind of system makes that choice make sense? That's what I want to explore in this series. Not just what people do in China, but the structures underneath it. This is Decode China, and I will see you in the next one.